Content warning. This series discusses the murder of a woman in her home. This episode includes references to sexually explicit language used by a witness, quoted from sworn testimony given at the inquest. The language is offensive and is included only because it forms part of the evidentiary record. Listener discretion is strongly advised. If you or someone you know needs support, contact Lifeline on 131114 or 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732 or your local crisis service. 90 minutes before Mary Anne Fagan was murdered, 2 council workers were sitting on a fence in her front garden. The fence faced her house. One of them was talking about her body, about her breasts, about what he imagined doing to her. His conversation was explicit. He spoke about her in graphic sexual terms to the man beside him. 90 minutes later, Mary Anne Fagan was dead. 2 months later, the man who held that conversation sat across a table from a homicide detective in Russell Street. He sat there for, he stated, over 16 hours. By the close, the homicide squad believed it had assembled the case to charge the man in connection with Mary Anne's death. It never eventuated. So how did it happen that the man police believed killed Mary Anne Fagan was never charged with her murder? Part 4. Mary Anne Fagan. By 10:30 on the morning of Friday, 17 February 1978, 3 things had happened on the corner of Bailey Avenue and Dandenong Road, Armadale. A council road crew had arrived to repair a damaged section of roadway. Mary Anne Fagan had returned from dropping her son at school. She had spoken to one of the workers, a labourer, about silt washed into her driveway from a burst water main. And a uniformed police constable driving through Bailey Avenue had seen her standing in her front garden. He was the last person confirmed to have seen her alive. The investigation, when it came to construct its case, would settle on a time of death window that placed her killing in the late morning, between approximately 10:30 and 11:30 a.m. That window was narrower than the forensic evidence strictly permitted, but it was the window the investigation came to rely on. And it was the window in which one of the men on the corner could not be accounted for. His name was James. The crew that morning was 3 men. Robert was 25 years old, a single man living with his parents in East Malvern. He drove the truck. Of the 3, Robert's movements are the most independently verifiable. He spent most of the morning away from the site collecting materials, and his arrivals and departures were observed by others. Ken was 42. A single man living in a self-contained flat in East Malvern. 22 years with the council. He drove the backhoe. James was 43. Living with his de facto partner Raylene and their 3.5-year-old daughter in a flat in Paran. He had been at the council for approximately 3 months. He was the labourer, and by his own description, a sort of unpaid crew leader. The job card came to him. He directed the work on the ground when the truck driver and the backhoe operator were elsewhere. James did not hold a driver's licence. Of the 3 men on the crew, he was the only one who could not drive either of the worksite's vehicles. he depended on Robert for transport between the worksite and the depot. When he moved during his working day, beyond the immediate corner, he moved on foot. These three men were assigned the Bailey Avenue job that morning by the yard foreman, Alan. The repair was straightforward. A burst water main, fixed days earlier by the Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works, had damaged a section of the roadway. By the council crew's estimation, it would take about 3 hours for a private contractor to complete. They left the depot at 7:45 a.m. By 9 o'clock, the damaged section had been cut out with jackhammers, the rubbish loaded into the truck, the hole cleaned. They needed crushed rock from the depot. Robert and Ken went together to get it. James remained at the site. It was at approximately this time, around 9 o'clock, that Mary Anne Fagan returned from the school run, turned into Bailey Avenue, and spoke to James about the mess in her driveway. She came to him. She singled him out from the three workers. She spoke to him directly, alone, at her own property. By James's own account, given much later under questioning, she was concerned about the silt washed into the rear of her driveway by the burst water main. The conversation was brief. Functional. The kind of conversation a homeowner has with a council worker. But it was the moment of contact. Robert and Ken returned with the crushed rock at about 9:30. They tipped it into the hole. Morning tea followed, just some simple sandwiches and coffee. Robert had stopped at a takeaway shop on the way back. James and Robert sat in the truck. Ken sat in the backhoe. After morning tea, they levelled the crushed rock. Then Robert left to collect the hot mix from a depot in Springvale, a round trip of approximately an hour and a half. Before he left, he told James and Ken that if he was not back by 11:30, they should head back to the depot for lunch in the backhoe, and he would pick James up from there. Robert's departure meant the truck was gone. Ken still had the backhoe. He would later drive it back to the depot at lunchtime. James, without a licence, did not have that option. If he wanted to move during the hour and a half Robert was away, he had to walk. Both men did leave the site, separately and on foot, during that period. Ken up a lane off Gladstone Avenue. James down Dandenong Road. Neither was at the worksite for the bulk of the morning's middle hour. Shortly after Robert left, the foreman, Alan, arrived. It was approximately 10:15. Alan inspected the job, discussed what remained, and walked with James down toward the Fagan property to look at the rubbish washed into the rear driveway area. Alan left at approximately 10:30, and then the site emptied. Before it emptied, something else had happened. Sometime before 10:30 a.m, after the rock had been tipped, before Alan arrived, James and Ken sat down on a fence. The fence was the boundary to the Fagan property. On James's own admission, given 2 months later in Russell Street, they sat facing 575 Dandenong Road. He and Ken were looking at her house. And while they were looking at her house, James began to talk. He said Mrs. Fagan was a good sort. He said he wanted to knock her off, in the street language of the day, to have sex with her, and bite her on the tits. He said, when I knocked them off, they stayed knocked off, like they've been hit by a plate full of porridge. And then he said something else to Ken. Ken, a 42-year-old man who had told police he had never had sex with a woman in his life. James admitted at inquest that he said, "I might be able to get you your first." Investigators regarded the conversation as significant. It had taken place that morning on a fence facing the Fagan property by a man who had spoken to Mary Anne Fagan directly only a short time earlier, and who would later become the investigation's prime suspect. The man himself in the witness box at the inquest said something different. The crude expressions, he said, the bucket full of porridge, the language about biting, were borrowed expressions. He had picked them up years earlier from a man he knew that had worked in the Navy. He used them rarely. By his own estimate, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year. They were locker room expressions, recycled across years of male company, applied to women in general. The conversation that morning was, in his own words at the inquest, a terrible, shocking conversation. He did not deny having had it. He did not minimise the language. He said only that the expressions were not original to him, were not unique to that morning, and were not the language of a man whose sexual focus was building towards a particular woman. His partner of 8 years, Raylene, would later give evidence that she had never heard him use the expression about biting in all the time they had been together. She had heard the porridge line once, told as a joke, attributed to a man from Horsham. She said her partner did not, at home, speak filth. The investigation read it one way. The men closest to him and the man himself in the witness box read it another. What the conversation meant is one of the questions this case turns on. That it happened that morning on that fence is not in dispute. At approximately 10:30, the site emptied. Robert was gone. He had been gone since shortly before 10 on his way to Springvale. Alan left after walking the rear driveway with James. Ken left. He said he had gone to a small alley up the road to vomit after a night of drinking. And James left. Of the 4 men who had been at the corner that morning, 3 placed themselves somewhere else for the next 45 minutes. Robert was on the road to Springvale. Alan was back at the depot. Ken had walked to the alleyway to vomit. Only James's account changed. 3 times. In his first statement, given the evening of Mary Anne's murder on 17 February at the Armadale Hotel to a uniformed constable while he had been drinking, James said he had worked on the road all day and seen nothing. He said he had gone to knock on the front door of 575 Dandenong Road before lunch, but changed his mind. He said nothing about speaking to a lady. He said nothing about going into her driveway. He said nothing about a blue terry toweling hat. He said nothing about leaving the worksite alone. He said nothing about a bookmaker. 3 days later, that first statement began to come apart. A Melbourne newspaper had carried, over the weekend, a request from the homicide squad. Anyone who had seen a workman in a blue terry toweling hat speaking to Mrs. Fagan that morning should contact police. A witness had come forward. A woman who had been waiting at the tram stop at Dandenong Road that Friday morning. She had seen Mrs. Fagan drive her Holden station wagon from Dandenong Road into Bailey Avenue at about 9:15, stop, and speak to a workman in a blue terry toweling hat. That workman was James. He was the only man on the crew wearing such a hat. On the Monday morning, his workmate Robert brought James into Malvern Police Station. James now made his second statement. Yes, he said, he was the man in the blue hat. Yes, he had spoken to a lady in a car in Bailey Avenue. And yes, he had walked with her into the open driveway of her property to inspect the silt washed up from the burst water main. He had not mentioned any of this on Friday evening. By the time the third interview came, in April, the investigators had come to regard the omissions in James's statements not as oversight, but as concealment. In his third interview on 20 April 1978, conducted by a detective sergeant from the homicide squad at Russell Street, the account changed again. The interview ran through the day and into the night. The initial detective left the office at 11:15 p.m. At 10 past midnight, a second detective came in and began again. Across that day, James admitted in sequence that he had left the worksite during the morning, that he had gone to the Railway Hotel in Glenferrie Road to use the toilet, that he had gone to the milk bar next door to the Railway Hotel to buy a packet of Benson and Hedges, that he had then gone to a house in Railway Avenue, Armadale, to visit his SP bookmaker, a man he knew only as Uncle Con, and eventually that he had sat on a fence outside 575 Dandenong Road with Ken and had a sexual conversation about the woman who lived there. Each admission contradicted what he had said 2 months earlier. The detective sergeant read each contradiction as a piece of the architecture of a man revealing only what he could no longer hide. Each new admission had emerged only after the previous version became difficult to maintain. He pressed the timing. The conversation on the evidence had taken place that morning, before he left the worksite. The decision to approach her door, on James's own account, had taken place sometime later that morning. The door belonged to the same woman they had been discussing on the fence outside her property earlier that morning. James maintained the two were unrelated. The exact length of his absence from the worksite was critical. The senior detective on scene had a working theory about the time of death. Mrs. Fagan had spoken to her husband on the phone earlier that morning. The pathologist who examined the body that evening estimated, from the body temperature and the state of rigour, a window of several hours within which the death could have occurred. The investigators narrowed that window. They placed the killing between 10:30 and 11:30. It was put to Ken in the witness box almost as a flat statement of fact. I am putting it to you that Mrs. Fagan was killed between 10:30 and 11:30 that morning. That was precisely the window in which James could not be accounted for. The window the investigation chose was narrower than the pathologist's evidence strictly required. The pathologist's actual finding permitted death any time between approximately 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. The investigation chose the early end of that range. Whether they chose it because the evidence pointed there or because their suspect was unaccounted for in that period is one of the questions this case has carried unanswered for nearly 50 years. The alibi for the gap rested on Uncle Con, the retired SP bookmaker of Railway Avenue, Armadale, who had been an illegal starting price bookmaker for many years. Con gave a statement to detectives. he gave evidence on oath at the inquest. His evidence was, in two specific respects, presented by the investigation as devastating to James's account. First, and this was the line the detectives kept returning to, Con said that James had always come to his home after 5 p.m, usually on a Thursday or a Friday, to pick up his money. He said James had never come to collect money from his home at any time before 5 p.m. Second, Con said that as of February 1978, James owed him $40 and had not been seen at the bookmaker's house for some time. On the face of it, the denials were complete. The man James said had paid him out at 10:30 on Friday morning was a man who, on his own sworn evidence, never paid out before 5 p.m. To investigators, the bookmaker evidence became another contradiction in a widening pattern. Then, the money. James had returned to the worksite that afternoon with cash he could not explain. But across the course of the long interview with the detective sergeant, James gave at least 4 different accounts of where the money came from. The first, he had won it at the races and had been paid by the bookmaker. The second, he had had it from earlier. The third, he didn't know where it came from. The fourth, given under direct pressure. I didn't have money. 4 positions on a single question across over 16 hours of questioning. The investigation read the shifts as escalating deception. Across the morning of 17 February 1978, the 3 council workmen had been laying hot bitumen mix on the road repair. There was a tar pot, a small open vessel of hot bitumen, on the footpath outside the Fagan property. James, as the man on the footpath, was the closest to it. In the front bedroom where Mary Anne Fagan was found, her clothing was sent to the forensic science laboratory for examination. On a singlet, the forensic scientist found microscopic dark flecks. The flecks, he reported, appeared and behaved like bitumen. The investigation read the finding as evidence linking James to the scene. The flecks behaved like the material James was working with that morning. The material that would have been on his hands, his clothes, his boots, through the working day. And on the driveway between the rear gate and the garage of the Fagan property, photographed by the crime scene crew the same evening, was an industrial-soled boot print. The print led from the garage area toward the gateway into the backyard. James was wearing industrial-soled work boots that day. Police seized them from him on the 11th of April. The boot print was consistent with James's boot type. The boot print could have been left at any time during the morning when the workman had reason to be at the rear of the property. James had walked down the rear driveway twice that morning by his own admission. Once at about 9:15 a.m, when Mary Anne herself had shown him the silt washed up from the burst water main. And a second time at about 10 o'clock, when the foreman Alan walked the same path to inspect the same rubbish. On the first of those visits, James had, by his own description, tested the depth of the sludge with his boots while in the driveway. The interview transcript records his response when the bitumen evidence was put to him. The investigators said, "Tar has been found on clothing that was in the room where Mrs. Fagan was killed. Can you offer any explanation for that?" James said, "No, we didn't go into the house." The investigators responded with, "I put it to you, you didn't get the money from the SP. "You got it from Fagan's house." James said, "No, I did not go into the house. Never even knocked." The interviews continued over days and weeks. By the end of the process, the investigation believed it had assembled a coherent pattern of contradictions, omissions, and physical evidence linking James to the murder of Mary Anne Fagan. Across that day in Russell Street, the architecture of James's statements came apart. The bookmaker alibi, contradicted by Con. The worksite alibi, contradicted by witnesses who had seen him absent. The sexual conversation, concealed for 2 months, admitted only under sustained questioning. The $30, described in detail by his own workmate, denied by him in at least 4 different ways. The front door he had said he had not knocked on was the front door of a woman who had been murdered inside that house within several hours of him last being seen near it. The detective sergeant put it to him directly. "I put it to you that you have told these untruths and left things out to conceal your involvement in the death of Mrs. Fagan." James denied it. It was put to him again on a different formulation. "I put it to you that you were involved in the death of Mrs. Fagan." James said, No, not me. I couldn't hurt anybody." When asked finally whether he had killed her, James again said no. He said, "I want to go home. Charge me or let me go." The interview ended, and he was not charged. A council worker named Frank, a 48-year-old who had known James for most of the 14 months he had been at the council, gave evidence that added one further detail. On the evening of the murder, James had paid Frank $5 at the Armadale Hotel. Frank believed it was a repayment of a debt, possibly from the previous week. That was the statement Frank gave to police in 1978. At the inquest, under cross-examination, Frank could not confirm the transaction. He could not be sure whether James had paid him $5 or whether he himself had given James $3. He could not be sure which night the transaction happened. He could not be sure that his statement to police had reflected what he actually remembered at the time. "It is that long ago," he said, "I just forget." The coroner heard the statement. He also heard the witness withdraw it. The coroner's own working notes, found on a page in the coronial file, record the assessment in 11 blunt words. Statements true. Subsequent statements. Had not told the police the truth. That note was written about James. And by April 1978, by the close of the long interview, the homicide squad believed it. Not in his first statement at the Armadale Hotel on the night of the murder. Not in his second statement 6 weeks later. And by the time investigators sat him down on 20 April 1978, the distance between what James had said and what police believe had actually happened was becoming vast. There is also the question of the screams. 2 independent witnesses said that they had heard screams from the direction of the Fagan home in the early afternoon. A builder working directly behind the property heard a muffled scream. A woman in a first-floor flat next door heard a loud scream lasting 4 to 5 seconds. Both gave their times by estimation. Neither had been wearing a watch. The woman in the flat, pressed at the inquest, moved her own estimate and conceded she had been unwell and under strain at the time. She accepted it was possible she had imagined it. The builder placed it between 1 o'clock and past, but said he could not be sure of the time. Their evidence, given on oath, went into the case file as evidence of screams in the early afternoon. At that time, the 3 council workers were back at the worksite after lunch. They were laying hot mix, working with rollers and rakes. All 3 said they heard nothing. The investigation read the screams as evidence the killing had been in progress in the afternoon, while the workmen were present and working. The screams placed the men closer to it, not further from it. The inquest was held on the 19th and 20th of June 1979. The coroner heard from the homicide detectives, the forensic scientists, the witnesses who had seen Mrs. Fagan that morning, the workmates, the bookmaker, the husband, and from James himself in the witness box for the better part of a day. He delivered his finding on the afternoon of the second day. The finding was an open one, that Mary Anne Fagan had died from hemorrhage from multiple stab wounds, feloniously, unlawfully and maliciously inflicted by a person unknown. No individual was charged. No individual was named in the formal inquisition. But in delivering it, the coroner had something to say about the evidence he had heard. He said the evidence of the 3 Malvern Council workmen who had been doing road repairs near the Fagan household on the day of the murder was, and these were his words, to say the least, not very satisfactory. He went further. One of those 3 witnesses, he said, had been, and these were the coroner's words again, picked up the next morning as the headline in a Melbourne newspaper, far from honest with the information he gave to police. He named the witness. He named James. The next morning, the newspaper headline ran, Fagan inquest told evidence in doubt. This is the weight of the evidence as the investigation by June 1979 understood it. 60-odd pages of one investigator's interview with James alone. A further 40 pages of the later interviews with James and Ken. Cross-examination at the inquest that ran across 2 days. 16 or 17 hours of questioning in one sitting, more across the months that followed the murder, by James's own count. By the close of those processes, the case the homicide squad believed it had assembled was this. A man who had been on the corner that morning. A man who had been singled out and spoken to by Mrs. Fagan directly at her own property, shortly before he sat on a fence opposite her house and made sexual remarks about her, in graphic terms, to a colleague. A man who had then left the worksite during what the investigation came to treat as the murder window. A man whose work material, bitumen, had appeared, in microscopic flecks, on clothes in Mary Anne Fagan's home where she was killed. A man whose industrial-soled work boots were consistent with the print at the rear gate of her property. A man who had returned to the worksite with money he could not consistently explain and gave at least 4 different accounts of where it had come from across many hours of questioning. A man whose alibi for the missing 45 minutes had been contradicted, on oath, by the named other party. A man who had lied to police on 3 separate occasions, across 3 separate statements, to 3 separate detectives. A man whom the coroner, in open court, had named as far from honest. The coroner's working note rendered the assessment in blunt words. Statements true, subsequent statements, had not told the police the truth. The coroner found the evidence of the council workers unsatisfactory. A senior officer connected to the investigation would tell a Melbourne newspaper almost 23 years afterward that the original investigation's failure to question the workmen properly in the first hours had been a serious flaw, and that the men were either suspects or potentially vital witnesses. By April 1978, the investigation's view of the man at the gate, the photo-fit witness sighting that had dominated the first 2 months of the investigation, had also shifted. The RAF parades were winding down. The photo-fit had produced no name. The new head of homicide had concluded that the witness sighting was, almost certainly, mistaken identity. The case the homicide squad believed it had assembled against James was substantial. The interrogation had run, by James's own estimation, for 16 or 17 hours in one sitting, with more across the months that followed. By the close, the squad believed the man at the table had not given them the truth about a single material question. The coroner understood why. The newspaper headline the next morning carried it into the public record. And yet, he was not charged. He was not charged in April 1978. He was not charged after the brief of evidence had been worked through. He was not charged when the inquest in June 1979 found the evidence unsatisfactory and named him in open court as far from honest. He was not named as the killer when the case was reopened in 2001. James had told investigators, "I want to go home. Charge me or let me go." Ultimately, that's exactly what happened. He was never charged. For over 48 years, the investigation has not had an answer to that gap. He didn't tell police the truth. That note was written. The case was built. The coroner spoke the words in open court. The headline ran the next morning. And nothing happened. Join us in the next instalment, where we take the evidence apart piece by piece and put it to the test to see what holds up with the constraints we know in the case, and ask whether the case that hardened around James can actually sustain the weight placed upon it. If you have information that could assist police in relation to the murder of Mary Anne Fagan, please contact Victoria Police Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000 or submit a confidential report online at www.police.vic.gov.au/crime-stoppers. Some names and non-essential identifying details have been changed for privacy. All core events and timings are drawn from publicly available records, inquest materials, and contemporaneous reporting. Unsolved, unforgotten, unfinished.